The Hyundai Ioniq 5 has been a worldwide smash hit, literally sending shockwaves to the industry solely because of how extremely good the car is. But with the Ioniq 5 being so good, it'll probably be a tough act for them to follow, right? This is the new Hyundai Ioniq 6, which based on its long list of awards, is proof that the Ioniq 5 wasn't just a one-hit wonder. So it got World Car of the Year, World Electric Car of the Year, and World Car Design of the Year. And basically, this slippery shape has led to a car with a drag coefficient of just 0.22 CV. Very aerodynamic indeed, and one of the most aerodynamic cars you could buy in the market today. So yeah, beginning with the front, you're gonna see the very smooth shape with a lack of vents. What you only have is, by the way, this vent sa baba, which opens and closes depending on the cooling needs of the car's battery. So of course, full LED headlights in the front of the car, and pagdating sa kanang sides, you're gonna see yung kanang large 20-inch wheels. These are wrapped, by the way, in interestingly, Pirelli P0 tires. Then as you're gonna move down the sides lalo, you're gonna see a continuous flowing shape, which again pays dividends to the car's very aerodynamic shape. As I go towards the back of the Ioniq 6, I think this is the best angle of this car for me. You have this dual-tiered spoiler, which is again something that looks interesting but is mostly dictated by aerodynamics. Now moving towards the bottom of the car, yun nga, interesting rear bumper with pixelized reflectors, not rear fog lights but reflectors in this case. And yeah, for me actually personally, since I prefer sedans over crossover SUVs, I do prefer the Ioniq 6 compared to the Ioniq 5, but that's just a matter of personal taste. So it's gonna be up to you whether you prefer this or the Ioniq 5, but most people I'm seeing in social media prefer the Ioniq 5 over the Ioniq 6. So let's now move inside the new Hyundai Ioniq 6 just to see how the interior compares sa kanyang very interesting exterior design. So here in the interior of the Hyundai Ioniq 6, as you're gonna see, the design is very lounge-like, very futuristic. Though unlike yung Ioniq 5 where it's sort of trying to be a living room on wheels, ito naman, yung Ioniq 6 looks sportier, especially due to this rising center console dito, which of course adds this more cocooned and sporty feel. And yes, in terms of the driving position actually, you sit lower compared to the Ioniq 5. Now let's talk about the material aspect of the car's interior, because here in the doors, what you have here is hard, dense plastic. It's not cheap in a way na it feels brittle. It's actually very dense, hard plastic. And this, by the way, is recycled plastic, kaya siya ganun yung pagkaramdam niya. As for the other parts of the dash, there's also soft touch plastics here. The center console here is also wrapped in soft leather, or I'm not sure what material this is if I were being honest, pero ang alam ko, this is also recycled materials, yung kanang nasa center console and the armrest. Speaking of the center console, your controls for the windows and doors are in this part of the vehicle as well, not on the doors as you would usually expect in normal cars or other cars basically. Oh, and take a look at the key of the Hyundai Ioniq 6 because it looks really nice and it basically looks like the Hyundai logo. Then let's now go to the tech features of the car. What you have here is the usual 12.3-inch infotainment that you would normally get used to. Very responsive interface. It looks nicely well presented. I like the fact that you have a home screen where you're able to see a few information like your battery status and all that. And then also worth talking about is the car's LED ambient lighting. You have two layers, I guess, of ambient lights, which somehow gives a very nice vibe sa gabi, which is complemented by the car's nice sounding Bose sound system. Other features worth mentioning, by the way, is the sunroof here. Hindi nga na siya panoramic sunroof like what you would get in the Ioniq 5, but at least you do have a sunroof. And then you also have here touch capacitive stuff for the lights and all those overhead console features. So now let's hop into the back seats ngayon of the Ioniq 6 and see what life is like back there. So here in the back of the Hyundai Ioniq 6, as you're gonna see, there's plenty of legroom for my 5'11" height, despite this front seat being set for my driving position. Now kahit mag-de-quattro ako dito, there's still plenty of legroom here. It's pretty much palatial in terms of legroom. Yun nga lang though, what isn't palatial is yung kanyang headroom because of that sloping roofline. The Ioniq 5, of course, with its more upright shape, has a better provision for headroom. Pero for my 5'11" height, kahit paano ngayon, I do still fit. But anyway, in terms of width, it's actually a pretty wide interior, and because of the electric vehicle architecture, of course, the floor of the car is completely flat. And of course, being an electric car, sabihin na rin natin ng part na yun, it has a very long wheelbase. Now, as for amenities here at the back of the Ioniq 6, you're gonna see na you can move the front passenger seat like this. And you also have rear heated seats kahit nasa Pilipinas ka, and I'm not sure why you're gonna be using such a feature. Let's turn that off. Now, you also have the usual 2 cup holders in the center armrest. Windows go all the way down. Okay, almost all the way down. And then also worth noting, by the way, is you also have a 220 volt or a household outlet here under the rear seats of the Ioniq 6. You also have 2 USB-C fast charging ports along with your own rear aircon vents. So now let's talk about trunk space with the Ioniq 6, because being a car that's built from the ground up to be an electric car and not sharing a platform with, of course, a gas or diesel vehicle, ang advantage nun is you have both a rear trunk and a front trunk. The rear trunk has this amount of size, and then at the front, you also have a good amount of size, by the way, and that's a good place for you to store your charging cable. And then just leave the rear trunk for practically everything else.
The Hyundai Ioniq 6 comes solely as a fully loaded GLS long-range model. Therefore, you get the large 77.4 kWh battery that's good for up to 545 kilometers. Oh, and like the Ioniq 5, this comes with the 800 volt architecture enabled by the eGMP platform. As a result, the Ioniq 6 has one of the fastest charging speeds, along with having vehicle-to-load bidirectional charging capabilities.
So just like the Hyundai Ioniq 5, the Ioniq 6 is a very refined long-distance cruiser. And of course, being electric, you have no transmission, engine, or whatever kind of mechanical noises to deal with. So syempre, unsurprisingly, that leads to a quiet driving experience. Pero here in the Ioniq 6, I do think that this car's quieter compared to the Ioniq 5. It probably has to do with the fact na, syempre, this car is more aerodynamic, which means less wind noise. Pero in terms of the tire noise din kasi, it's actually quieter in the road noise aspect compared to the Ioniq 5. Speaking of the tires, as mentioned kanina, this is riding on Pirelli P0 tires. So yeah, later we're gonna be able to find out how the tire choice leads to some interesting driving characteristics. Then other refinement aspects to talk about, of course, is yung kanyang ride quality, which here in the Ioniq 6, I do think that this car's a bit firmer. Hindi siya matagtag, mind you, but the result here is the car feels more controlled, mas controlled yung ride quality niya, and therefore, ang resulta niya is there's less vertical motions whenever going through yung mga undulations and SETEX. Large bumps are still dealt with delicacy in this car, pero due to the lower profile tires ng 20-inch wheels ito compared to the 20-inch wheels in the Ioniq 5, which has thicker sidewall, there's a stronger sensation with the smaller bumps nga lang compared to the Ioniq 5. Pero overall naman, this Ioniq 6 deals with bumps really well, and due to the slightly firmer damping ng suspension nga, yun nga as mentioned, this offers a more controlled ride as a result. The chassis, of course, the eGMP platform is very rigid, especially due to the batteries, of course, being in the lower portion of the car and being also inherently part of the car structure. It's also very efficient, so that aerodynamic shape is paying dividends to the car's range. So kanina we left Santa Rosa, Laguna with more than 550 kilometers of range. Pero nga, fuel efficiency, or rather, energy efficiency, this is currently doing 6.2 kilometers per kilowatt hour, which is really good by electric car standards, and that's a figure that's considered efficient for electric cars, yung 6 kilometer to 7 kilometer per kilowatt hour range. So as we now enter a set of twisty roads, how does the Ioniq 6 perform in terms of the handling aspect? Well, compared to the Ioniq 5, the Ioniq 6 has a bit of a sportier edge. I wouldn't call it a sporty car though, because I do think that the i4 is still the more fun car compared to the Ioniq 6. It's just that compared lang to the Ioniq 5, this is a bit sportier because, well, first and foremost, you sit lower in this car. And due to the slightly stiffer damping sa suspension niya, this car deals pretty well with body roll, much more pa nga than the Ioniq 5. So as we enter this set of sweeping corners, this car is swinging well to your steering inputs. Speaking of the steering, I also do think that the steering here is a bit more responsive compared to the Ioniq 5. So this has more on-center immediacy compared to the one in the Ioniq 5. And remember those Pirelli P0 tires? So the Pirelli P0 tires do actually help in making the Ioniq 6 feel sportier thanks to these tires providing a lot of grip. Yes, it's sportier than the Ioniq 5 but not a sporty car, I still think. What I do think about the Ioniq 6 though, however, is that this car offers a great balance with handling, sportiness to a certain degree, and of course, long-distance driving comfort. Because this car is very relaxing, and even here, sa mga twisty roads, with a mix of small and big bumps, this car is really dealing well with such road imperfections. Also worth noting in an electric car always would be the brakes, because I do like the brake feel of the Ioniq 6. It's firm, it's very reassuring, and just like the Ioniq 5, this feels natural. Hindi siya yung parang mga other electrified cars wherein the brakes feel yung parang yung first 10% ng apak niya has this sort of weird spongy feel. Because as usual nga with electric cars or even hybrids, you have regenerative braking. But here in the Ioniq 6, the regenerative braking is well tuned. And speaking of the regen brakes nga pala, this has another mode apart from the usual one-pedal driving. This has what you call a smart regen. So basically with smart regen, it will automatically adjust yung intensity ng kanyang regenerative braking, yung kanyang parang pag-let go mo ng coasting, yung pag-let go mo ng throttle bale. And if it detects or if it thinks that there's a car close to you or getting closer to you, it's gonna apply a bit of regen braking automatically. Takes a bit of getting used to, if I were being honest, yung kanyang smart regen. Pero once you've gotten used to the system, I think it's gonna be perfectly fine for you. But personally, I'd rather have self-control of my regenerative braking intensity.
The Hyundai Ioniq 6 starts at a little under 3.8 million pesos, exactly 100k more than the Ioniq 5 long range. Combined with the fact that this isn't a crossover SUV, this explains why the Ioniq 5 is far more popular. Remember, Filipinos nowadays simply prefer crossover SUVs. But if you're in the market for an electric executive sedan, then there's nothing quite like the Ioniq 6.